Ladies and gentlemen, museums have always been political. Museums have played a central role in helping the nations of the world define themselves, connect to their own histories, and build a sense of identity. Museums also help nations understand each other. I often have thought that one of the best ways of connecting very quickly with another country that I visit is to go and pay a visit to the National Museum, and I've seen some wonderful national museums around the world. So museums do play an important role in structuring the world in which we live, in defining the world in which we live. And so it's a great pleasure for us to present a lecture today on museums and their place in the world. And who better to present this particular lecture than Andrew Sayers. Andrew Sayers joined the National Museum of Australia as its new director in June 2010, bringing a wealth of cultural sector experience and knowledge. He completed a Bachelor of Arts honours in Fine Arts at Sydney University in 1979. He was appointed to the position of Curatorial Assistant at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 1979 and became Registrar of Collections in 1980. He left this position to become Assistant Director at the Newcastle Regional Art Gallery from 1981 to 1985. Mr. Sayers moved to the National Gallery of Australia in 1985, where he remained for 13 years. In May 1996, he was appointed Assistant Director of Collections. Andrew Sayers was appointed Director of the National Portrait Gallery in April 1998. During his tenure at the National Portrait Gallery, Mr. Sayers oversaw its transformation into a significant national cultural institution. In 2008, the Portrait Gallery moved into a new lakeside building and attracted a number of international exhibitions, including Vanity Fair portraits, photographs 1913 to 2008, and Obey, Shepherd Ferry poster. His principal exhibitions include New Worlds from Old, 19th Century Australian and American Landscapes, Aboriginal Artists of the 19th Century, Sidney Nolan, The Ned Kelly Story, and The World of Thea Proctor. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Andrew Sayers.
Thank you very much, Michael. While I was waiting to come into this lecture, I was sitting in a room which had a painting by Sidney Nolan, a painting by Russell Drysdale, and a painting by Michael Kmidt. So I immediately felt very comfortable and at home, since, as Michael pointed out in his introduction, much of my career has been involved with the study of Australian art history. And in fact, those three artists were, I guess, cultural ambassadors for Australia. Sidney Nolan's Kelly paintings were shown very, very soon after they were painted, in fact, in Rome. And Michael Kmidt and Russell Drysdale were key parts of international exhibitions of Australian painting that were shown in Britain in the 1960s. I took up the position of Director of the National Museum of Australia 6 months ago to this very day, on the 1st of June this year. And a week later, I was seated on the flower-decked podium of the National Art Museum of China for the opening of the exhibition Punya Painting Out of the Australian Desert. This exhibition was drawn from our collection at the National Museum and was part of the cultural program of the Year of Australia in China. And it included some masterpieces of the Punya painting movement that began in 1971 and developed over subsequent decades to become Australia's most distinctive and recognisable cultural export. At the press conference the following day, I and other speakers sought to explain the particular and unique characteristics of Western desert painting and fielded questions from the Chinese media, many of which showed an interest in government policy, especially Australian government policy in the protection of the culture of Indigenous Australians. Now, most of my fellow museum directors around the world will have found themselves on similar podiums, no doubt musing between the speeches on the global ambassadorial roles we now find ourselves playing on a regular basis. There are several aspects of this ambassadorial role that I want to touch on today. Firstly, I want to explore globalisation and what it means for national museums. I want to look at the way in which museums see their responsibilities as citizens of the world, and I'll introduce some examples of museums as conduits of soft diplomacy. And finally, I want to look at some of the directions, the future directions we might take in Australia, and find useful and significant roles for Australian museums as a voice in the world. The exhibition that we opened in Beijing earlier this year, Punya Painting Out of the Australian Desert, was in part the story of the tentative start and then the explosion of art making in the Western Desert. It's a compelling and an ongoing episode, and it's been shared with the world almost from its inception in the early 1970s through international touring exhibitions organised by the Australia Council's Aboriginal Arts Board. The Punya story is one of the great Australian stories, and it's a part of the interwoven fabric of the Australian story. And if you were to ask me, what is the museum's story, I would answer, the Australian story. People expect institutions such as the National Museum of Australia to tell the Australian story. They also expect that a visit to the museum will inform them in some way about national identity, which is a much more complex proposition. Even if national museums do not set out to define national identity explicitly, there's an expectation that such institutions will have something to say about the things that are central to our nationhood, in our case, to the definition of Australia and Australianness. Clearly, there's a responsibility on the part of a national museum to consider carefully its role in this area. In the past decade, much discussion has gone on in the museum about the markers and symbols of nation. Furthermore, the museum has been part of a quite public disagreement about the way in which Australia's history of Indigenous and settler conflict has been presented as a defining dimension of our national ethos. Increasingly, the very idea of national identity seems to lead us into dangerous territory. The risks associated with overt declarations of national identity in the museum context have been highlighted in recent public debates in France. This year, President Sarkozy announced the establishment of a museum of French history, the Maison de l'Histoire de France, to be established in the Grand National Archives building in Paris. In announcing the museum, Sarkozy declared that its aim was, quote, to reinforce national identity. His special advisor described the museum as an answer to a French identity crisis. Now, this rhetoric immediately rang alarm bells. Many French historians and museologists have an uneasy feeling that such a museum will attempt to entrench an insular idea of what it means to be French. As correspondents in Le Monde pointed out, the Maison de l'Histoire de France is the brainchild of a president whose use of the phrase national identity has been closely linked to anti-immigration policies. As one historian correspondent commented there, one does not build a nation on the rejection of immigrants. A fortnight ago, however, Sarkozy was reported to have said in a television interview that he'd given up on the terminology national identity, taking responsibility for the fact that the debate he invited about the idea had sparked misunderstanding and created tension. He's now decoupled the term from the immigration portfolio in his cabinet. Now, there are some important lessons here. On the one hand, such politically led debates are almost always going to be hijacked and to create tension. Besides, we have to ask whether this question about the nature of national identity is a question worth asking at all. Ideas of national identity are such complex sets of notions that it's impossible to grasp them or pin them down. On this subject, as on so many subjects, Amartya Sen cuts through the thicket of obscurity in a particularly enlightening way. In Sen's view, we have to resist two unfounded but often implicitly invoked assumptions. One, the presumption that we have a single or at least a principal or a dominant identity. And two, the supposition that we discover our identity with no room for choice. Sen gives a wonderfully extravagant but convincing example to underscore his point. And I quote, "The same person can be of Indian origin, a Parsi, a French citizen, a US resident, a woman, a poet, a vegetarian, an anthropologist, a university professor, a Christian, a birdwatcher, and an avid believer in extraterrestrial life." Now, I think it's the role of museums to investigate and to reveal these specific collectivities whilst leaving the interpretation of national identity as a set of possibilities imagined by our audiences. If there is one unifying idea of national identity, it comes down to a geographical idea. It's about place. It's admittedly complex in its articulation, but it is a basic fact of our existence that we all inhabit this particular place, Australia. From this point of view, we can move to the idea of citizenship, and from there to the interpretive responsibilities of museums. Place, and all the other things, people, stories and conditions that derive from place, only get us so far, though. In defining or touching on national identity, we operate in a world that's shaped by the transnational. This obvious fact has created a lot of soul-searching in museums, and there have been umpteen museum conferences across the globe exploring tensions between, on the one hand, the expectation that we will engage with distinctive national stories, and on the other hand, a recognition that fundamental elements of the way we live now are parts of globalised systems. The digital revolution has exaggerated this phenomenon, but we can overstate its newness. The history of museums in Australia has always been linked closely to the rest of the world. If we look at museums in the 19th century, we can see them behaving as mirrors of the intellectual enthusiasms and cultural imperatives of Britain and, in particular, German-speaking nations. Indeed, colonial museums saw themselves very much as parts of an established worldwide community of scientific and material exchange. Yet there now does seem to be a particular urgency about this phenomenon that's compelling museums to redefine their place in the world. It's not just global connectedness that's responsible for this, but also an increasingly cogent demand whose authority is community and locally based. The paradigmatic example is one of the greatest museums, the British Museum. On the British Museum website, you'll find a page entitled Statements, and these statements outline the museum's position on a range of disputed material in its collection. There you will find, for example, the British Museum's position regarding requests by the Greek government for the repatriation of the Parthenon marbles, a lodestone in the repatriation argument. In defence of its determination not to relinquish the marbles, the museum makes the following statement. The British Museum exists to tell the story of cultural achievement throughout the world, from the dawn of human history over 2 million years ago until the present day. The museum is a unique resource for the world. The breadth and depth of its collection allows the world public to examine cultural identities and explore the complex network of interconnected world cultures. Now, you won't have failed to register here the repetition of the word world. The British Museum is now consciously declaring itself as a museum of the world, and it's not alone among UK collecting institutions making this global claim. The Natural History Museum is keen to be seen not as a large historic building in South Kensington with a memorable collection of natural history exhibits, but an active player in assisting in research projects in developing countries, using the resource of its collection to help, for example, in the fight against malaria. And currently on ABC television there's a documentary called Museum of Life, which is devoted to talking about the Natural History London's part of world research. And the centrepiece of the UK pavilion at the Shanghai Expo earlier this year, the Seed Cathedral, was created in conjunction with Kew Gardens and their Millennium Seed Bank project, another collection-based biodiversity project with global reach. Now, the aspiration of the World Museum is, of course, not confined to Britain. The Louvre is one of the world museums to establish a branch in Abu Dhabi, part of the complex of museums being built there to open in 2012. The relationship between Abu Dhabi and the French government is based on a 30-year agreement signed in 2007. At the time the agreement was made, the then President Jacques Chirac commented that, quote, "By choosing the Louvre, the Emirate of Abu Dhabi not only sealed a partnership with the world's most visited and well-known museum, but selected one which, from its very inception, had a vocation to reach out to the world, to the essence of mankind through the contemplation of works of art." The Smithsonian Institution, Washington's collection of 19 museums, 9 research centres and a zoo, has identified 4 big goals for the near future. One of them is valuing world cultures. The goal here is described in Washington's characteristically lofty language. Quote, "As a steward and ambassador of cultural connections, with a presence in some 100 countries, and these include Australia, and expertise and collections that encompass the globe, we will build bridges of mutual respect and present the diversity of world cultures and the joy of creativity with accuracy, insight and reverence." End of quote. Now, to go back for a moment to the British Museum's argument for retaining the Parthenon marbles, it's interesting to see how the opposite view to that of the British Museum, the official Greek line on the Parthenon marbles, can be couched in equally supranational, even pan-European terms. Georgios Bulgarakis, the Greek Minister of Culture, said in a speech in 2006 that the request for the Parthenon marbles restoration exceeds our national territories and has nothing to do with chauvinism, as it is universal. The Parthenon is a universal monument. Our demand is ecumenical. The reunion of the marbles and our debt to honour is our debt of honour towards history. The museums, and here Bulgarakis referred to all the European museums, not just the British Museum, that have parts of the Parthenon complex in their collections, ought to meet their moral obligations towards the cultural and spiritual coherence of the united Europe. Another area where the British Museum has taken a particular stand is in the loan this year of the important ancient Babylonian cuneiform cylinder, the Cyrus cylinder, to the National Museum of Iran. On the principles at play here, Karen Armstrong, the well-known author and commentator on religious affairs and a British Museum trustee, said that this cultural exchange may make a small but timely contribution towards the creation of better relations between the West and Iran. This is a classic statement of soft diplomacy. Culture can build bridges that states cannot. What is reflected here is a wider strategy on the part of the British government, not simply to see its major institutions as parts of a global cultural community, but more specifically to use not only such small but timely contributions, but also larger gestures in accordance with foreign policy priorities. In 2008, the UK Department of Culture, Media and Sport allocated funding to a group of major UK museums to foster partnerships under a program called the World Collections Programme. Now, in September this year, I was in London talking to my museum counterparts, and they were all at the time wondering about the effect of the spending review. And the effect of the spending review, which is essentially 15% cuts across the budgets of museums in Britain to be delivered over a number of years was announced in October. Writing to the British Museum with this news, the UK Secretary of State Jeremy Hunt wrote, "I have not allocated specific funding for the World Collections Programme, but the Foreign Secretary and I would like to see that collaboration and your wider international work continue to develop over the next 4 years. The government's priorities will be the emerging powers of China, India, Brazil, the Gulf states, Russia and Japan, and we would welcome your active engagement in these countries and others with a resonance for your collections and audiences." It's hardly surprising that as museum directors we often think that we're often asked to do more with less. The word resonance there is a gloriously vague word covering a range of issues. And although Australia is not mentioned, there are 2 planned projects that register the British Museum's resonance with our country. In 2013, a major exhibition drawn from the British Museum's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections will be shown at the National Museum of Australia. And a crucial aspiration for this project is the forging of real and meaningful connections with Indigenous communities across Australia and their cultural heritage in the British Museum. Such connections are now the work of world museums. And in May 2011, the print room of the British Museum will mount an exhibition of Australian printmaking, the first broad-ranging historical survey exhibition of Australian art for many decades in Britain. In association with the exhibition, the British Museum will join with Kew Gardens in planting an Australian landscape garden in the museum's West Lawn. One of the most important issues for British institutions and indeed for Australia is in the area of the repatriation of culturally sensitive material, in particular the repatriation of human remains. This is a huge issue for any museum aspiring to be a part of the world community, and it's an area in which Australian museums are playing a vital role and a vital international role. In a strict sense, the obligations that govern the repatriation of human remains could not be described as global obligations because they are driven very much by specific locality associations for Indigenous communities. Australian governments have taken active steps over the past 9 years to assist in the complex process of negotiation, repatriation and eventual return to custodians. It has been a very successful and is an ongoing program. Since its inception, the National Museum of Australia has returned the remains of over 1,000 individuals to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and 360 secret and sacred objects. But this also is a two-way exchange. The National Museum assists in the repatriation of remains from willing overseas museums, many of which happen quietly and without publicity. And culturally sensitive material has also left Australia and been repatriated, for example, from the National Museum's collection to Maori and Native American communities. The museum also has a wider role in helping to present Indigenous culture in an international context. And this is very much in line with the way in which the Australian government seeks to present the face of Australia to the world. I could give many instances stretching back to 1941, when Aboriginal art was included in the Carnegie-sponsored Art of Australia exhibition shown in New York, Washington and Ottawa. Indeed, we could go back to the great exhibitions of the 19th century where Aboriginal artefacts were shown in colonial context. And those great exhibitions of the 19th century were the antecedents of the modern type of exhibition which is still going strong, and that is the Expo. But I want to confine myself to 2 recent examples. I mentioned the National Museum of Australia's exhibition of Western Desert paintings in Beijing at the outset. This exhibition was a recast version of the exhibition mounted at the National Museum in 2006-07. In Beijing, it was seen by over 170,000 people and was accompanied by a Chinese translation of the museum's 2007 exhibition catalogue. I want to touch too on the display of the National Gallery of Australia's exhibition Culture Warriors at the Katzen Art Centre a university museum in Washington in 2009. Culture Warriors was a touring version of the Australian Indigenous Art Triennial. And in the words of the Washington Post, though the show acts as the most civil of diplomats, it also subverts expectations. More important, its very existence acknowledges a country's history of state-mandated racism." End quote. The exhibition was deemed a success for Australian interests in the United States precisely because it was tough, critical and political, not in spite of these things. These two exhibitions here are, I think, effective examples of Australian cultural institutions working in this area of soft diplomacy. Both exhibitions were real partnerships between cultural institutions, and although they were facilitated and assisted by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, they were not conceived as exhibitions to sell Australia overseas. This is an important point. Cultural institutions are proudly independent when it comes to content. The two exhibitions were initially put together for Australian audiences, yet in an international context both were able to express complex and inflected messages about Australian culture and society. The federal government was able to play a facilitating rather than a generating role in these cultural exports. There was a dimension of Culture Warriors that was particularly valuable: the integration of a performative element in associated programs. Lectures were given, artists spoke at forums, musicians sang, and dancers danced. This human element, often overlooked if we see museums only as collections of objects, is a vital part of our role into the future, and it's where the most lasting impacts will occur. A further dimension of the human is the sharing of expertise, an area where Australia has a great deal to offer the world. In this area, the National Museum has many possibilities, but they are in fact replicated by state museums across the country. For example, our Memorandum of Understanding with China specifically refers to professional staff exchanges. This year, National Museum staff assisted the Vatican Ethnographic Museum to successfully mount an exhibition of their indigenous collections to coincide with the beatification of the canonisation of Mary MacKillop. Here again, the National Museum assisted in connecting indigenous communities with collections held overseas. And as a final example, the National Museum is a supporter of a joint initiative with ICOM, the International Committee of Museums, to pursue projects that maintain and strengthen cultural practices in the Pacific. Along with the state museums and with grant money provided by AusAid, Australia has over the past 5 years been able to assist in a number of museum projects, infrastructure, resource and database projects in the Solomons, Vanuatu and Fiji. ICOM is one of the international professional organisations through which the museums of Australia connect with those of a wider world, as are such organisations as the International Federation of the Friends of Museums. So not only at a governmental level, but also at the working level, we have very strong networks which we're able to draw upon. For the past 5 years, the National Museum of Australia has been working to a strategic plan which includes the aspiration that the institution becomes, quote, a recognised world-class museum. We're now in the process of rethinking this formulation to remove its overtone of cultural cringe and more accurately describe what the museum's place in the world could be. Of course, we've not given up on the aspiration to be recognised as world-class, but our activities into the future will be driven by asking, how can we play a distinctive part in the wider world? The answer seems to me to have 3 parts. I've outlined that very important human dimension, partnerships, with the Australian government in the facilitation of our work overseas, chiefly, but not only, through exhibitions. Secondly, I've touched on the real potential we have to build human capital with overseas partners and within our own country. Ultimately, however, we'll be able to play a distinctive role as a museum by being original, by getting beyond the international style of museum presentation, the homogenisation that means all museums across the world somehow look the same, and devise a new type of experience altogether. As we've discussed, the principal way in which our museums have been original in an international context is by showcasing the culture of Indigenous Australia. But originality is also a dimension of the way museums do things. The National Museum will become internationally significant by doing worthwhile things in a unique way. And in order to do this, we will need to use our own intellectual resource, our own collection, to be self-confident as well as self-reliant, but also to be ready to share ideas and expertise with global partners. In Australia, we do have a distinctive place, geographically and geopolitically. We have our own things to say, and we have our own ways of doing things. And in museums, we have a medium through which we can share these distinctive qualities with the world. Thank you.